Hello and welcome to this week's edition of the WION-VOA Co-Production. I'm your host, Susan Tehrani, coming to you live from New York City. We begin with how the conflict in the Middle East is impacting the upcoming U.S. presidential election.
Iran's attack on Israel and America's role in the Middle East as issues in this U.S. presidential campaign are a contest over which candidate backs Israel most. As incumbent, President Joe Biden oversaw the U.S. response to the attack and reaffirmed U.S. support for Israel in a meeting with the Iraqi Prime Minister.
The United States is committed to Israel's security. We're committed to a ceasefire that will bring the hostages home and preventing conflict from spreading beyond what it already has. We're also committed to the security of our personnel and partners in the region, including Iraq.
Politically, Biden is facing competing calls to do more to help secure the release of hostages held by Hamas and to get tougher with Israel over its attacks in Gaza. His opponent, Donald Trump, says none of the violence in the Middle East would have happened if he were still president, without explaining how.
I want to say God bless the people of Israel. They're under attack right now. That's because we show great weakness. This would not happen. The weakness that we've shown is unbelievable, and it would not have happened if we were in office. You know that. They know that. Everybody knows that.
The Trump campaign is working to portray Biden as weak on Israel on Trump's social media platform and through Republican lawmakers, including House Speaker Mike Johnson.
Joe Biden has transformed into an anti-Israel president. There's really no other way to characterize it. He's more concerned seemingly with placating the anti-Semitism in his base than standing with our historic and vitally important ally.
In the Midwestern state of Michigan, voter Carol Plissner says Biden needs to keep up his support for Israel.
I think initially President Biden's response to the situation was helpful and it was supportive. I think as time has gone on, that's become more questionable. And I think that the United States needs to have a stance that's deeply protective of democracy across the world. And that means deeply respectful of Israel.
Biden's support for Israel in Gaza is reason to oppose him, says Michigan voter Mohammed Mauri.
He's complicit in a catastrophe that's happening 1,000 miles away. People think that it's not hurting us, but it is. We're aiding it with our money.
Polling by Pew Research last month showed deep divides on the issue, with about 20% of U.S. voters saying Biden's striking the right balance, another 20% saying he's favoring Israel, and 16% saying he's favoring Palestinians. The largest group in that poll was not sure how well Biden's handling the issue. Scott Stearns, VOA News.
Joining us now with additional reporting is VOA's Jessica Stone. She's live at the White House. Hi, Jessica. Great to see you. U.S. officials say that Israel launched strikes on Iran. What is the latest?
Yeah, an Iran official confirming to reporters that there were blasts overnight at a military base near the city of Isfahan. A senior U.S. official says Israel did give a brief alert to the United States just ahead of that attack. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken has confirmed that the U.S. did not participate in that attack. Iran media reporting that the scale of these missiles was not extensive and that the nuclear sites inside Iran are secure. And of course, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said he would choose how and when to respond to Iran's attacks on Israel last weekend. Washington has repeatedly, along with the other G7 countries, been urging restraint on Israel's part. And in the meantime, Washington has also imposed new sanctions on Tehran, and the G7 foreign ministers meeting now in Italy are doing the same. Iran's president has warned that even, quote, the tiniest invasion of its territory would bring a harsh response. But at the same time, we are seeing Iranian media play down the scale of the attacks, and we have no significant reported injuries at this time. Susan?
Jessica, this week, House Speaker Mike Johnson called for a vote on additional military aid to Ukraine and Israel. What's in that package, and what will dictate whether or not this vote is held?
Yeah, so the House is doing this in a different way than the Senate has already done it. The House Speaker announcing on Wednesday that he will put to a vote on Saturday night 4 different measures separated out. So one for Ukraine aid, one for Israel aid, one for Taiwan and Indo-Pacific aid, and another on a variety of other issues to address spending in the international arena. That 4th bill also will address U.S.-Mexico border security, and of course that has been a key linchpin in whether or not these bills as a package would move forward. Johnson has been under incredible pressure not to bring the Ukraine aid in particular to the floor, not to even hold a vote on it, even as Ukraine is increasingly running out of weapons, running out of ammo in order to turn back Russia's attack. But Johnson is a Republican, and particularly the conservative wing of the party, as we've talked before, has been putting him under pressure. We will see how effective they can be in the coming hours as they vote on what's called the rule, which is the predicate to actually voting on all of these measures over the weekend. Meantime, President Joe Biden has called this a pivotal moment for both nations to defend their sovereignty, but with U.S. help. Susan?
Jessica, please do stay with me. I'd love to get your thoughts on our next story as well, where the Biden administration has launched a new effort to tackle the drug overdose epidemic here in the United States, which, according to the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2022, it took more than 100,000 lives. But as VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias reports, some critics say gaps remain in the government's strategy to save lives.
About 100,000 people die from drug overdoses each year in the United States, most from opioid use. To combat the epidemic, the White House has announced a nationwide call to action named Challenge to Save Lives from Overdose. The initiative calls on public and private sectors, ranging from education to transportation, to increase training on and access to a medication that can reverse an opioid overdose. It's called naloxone, also known by the brand name Narcan. Neera Tandon is the domestic policy advisor to President Joe Biden.
Our focus is trying to flood the zone to make naloxone accessible so that when someone has an acute attack, their lives can be saved. And I should say we're very proud of the fact that the Food and Drug Administration, during the course of this administration, has made sure that naloxone is over the counter. So it's accessible by all Americans.
Tandon also says the Biden administration has invested over $100 billion on tackling the overdose crisis and coordinated with other countries to disrupt the flow of illegal drugs into the U.S. Mexico and China are the primary source countries for fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances, according to the Drug Enforcement Administration.
We have deployed new technologies at the border to ensure that we are able to interdict fentanyl, but we really also are working with the government in Mexico to ensure that they are taking the actions they need to reduce the flow of fentanyl, opioids, etc. We are also engaged directly in our bilateral relationship with China. A lot of the ingredients for fentanyl are coming from China into Mexico.
Still, some analysts are calling for more emphasis on overdose prevention.
That everybody is aware of the risks, even the people who don't think of themselves as users. That there's access to long-term recovery services through housing, through post-criminal justice interventions, through employment assistance.
Victoria St. Arnold would like to see more grief counseling and efforts to combat the stigma of drug addiction. VOA first met her when she lost her husband in 2021 to an overdose of pain medication laced with fentanyl.
I just felt like everybody was judging our situation and judging my husband, judging me for being with my husband. And it's very hard to go to try to get resources and assistance when you constantly meet that barrier of somebody's opinion.
The White House plans to ramp up activities for its challenge to save lives from overdose through the summer, when a spike in overdoses is often seen. Veronica Balderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
Okay, Jessica Stone is still with us live from the White House. Jessica, thanks for sticking around. Washington and Beijing started a counter-narcotics working group back in January. This was to address the issue of Chinese-made precursor chemicals for fentanyl. Has any progress been made?
Well, they are keeping up those meetings, first of all, and a Homeland Security advisor to the White House told PBS News in January that actually right after that Xi Jinping meeting with President Biden in San Francisco, there was progress. There was a drop in shipments of those chemicals coming to the United States, or rather to Mexico and through to the United States. But this week we heard a congressional committee report that said basically if China were truly serious about stopping the flow of those chemicals outside of the country, they would cease to provide subsidies to those chemical companies for exporting fentanyl precursors abroad. Those subsidies are currently only offered to chemical companies inside China for external exports, not for any domestic production of and sale of those chemicals. A spokesperson, though, at the Chinese embassy in Washington did say that Beijing is actually sincere in its efforts to cooperate on drug control with Washington. But a Brookings Institute analyst testifying this week on Capitol Hill said, look, we will know that there is progress if we see China and the United States cooperating on intelligence sharing and on prosecution and sentencing of these companies or of these crimes inside of China, making them a crime essentially. In the meantime, the Brookings analyst has also said that China is really looking for the fentanyl issue to be read in the broader relationship of U.S.-China relations. Essentially, by taking these steps on fentanyl, they're expecting to see concessions on the U.S. part, in particular, a reduction of tariffs. Susan?
Very interesting. And you mentioned that Beijing is looking for Washington to lower tariffs, a reduction in tariffs. But as we saw this week, President Biden is now planning to triple China's tariffs on steel and aluminum imports. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it doesn't appear it's going in Beijing's favor in that respect, absolutely. You know, labor unions are a key constituency for the Democratic Party, of which U.S. President Joe Biden is, of course, the figurehead. He needs those votes, and he's been courting those voters throughout his campaign, and they have been pushing him for a while now to increase tariffs on Chinese exports of aluminum and of steel because it impacts the U.S. steel industry, they argue, because often these goods are underpriced and they are considered intentionally underpriced to dominate the market. On Wednesday, Biden did campaign in front of the U.S. steelworkers in Pittsburgh. This is a classic and a very key constituency in that part of the United States. This is really the heart of the U.S. steel industry. And so these voters are really the backstop of the union and of the industry. And he accused China of, quote, cheating, not competing when it comes to steel trade. China is responsible, of course, for about half of all global steel production. So this issue is significant in the U.S.-China trade relationship. The Trump campaign weighing in saying you're just doing the same thing we have campaigned on for a long time. You guys are hypocrites. Meantime, the White House denies any political motivation. A senior administration official saying that the move is, in fact, not aimed at courting voters. Susan?
Very interesting indeed. VOA's Jessica Stone joining us this Friday live from the White House. Jessica, great to talk to you and have a great weekend.
Good to be with you. You too.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.